Welcome. In today's video, we are going to talk about watercolor techniques for beginners. Some of the terminology that we're going to talk about is a flat wash, a graded wash, sometimes called gradient wash or gradated wash, a variegated wash, and lifting out color. We will also talk about scumbling, stippling, wet on wet, and spattering. So there are many different ways to apply your paint, and the way in which you apply it can help suggest the type of illusion that you're going for your painting. So it's important that you understand the different watercolor techniques that you can practice so that you can get confident in your watercolor journey. So the first technique that we are going to talk about is a flat wash. And a flat wash is an even layer of diluted color that you can use to tone larger areas of your painting. This can include the ground or a body of water. So in order to do a flat wash, you're going to tilt your support at a slight angle. Then you're going to take your brush and load it very heavily with diluted color. After you do this, you're going to make even strokes over the area. Each stroke should overlap the previous, picking up any drips of the previous strokes along the way. And you're going to add a layer until the whole surface is covered in your pigment. Next, we have a graded wash, sometimes called a gradient or gradated wash. And a graded wash is an area of color that will gradually fade in intensity. So this is perfect for rendering skies. To do a graded wash, you're going to start with stroking a band of color across your paper. Then you're going to add more water to your brush, and you're going to make another stroke so it slightly overlaps the first. You're going to continue overlapping strokes, making sure to dip your brush in the water before each stroke. Now, you should notice that the color will lose intensity as you continue to make your strokes, and this will create a smooth blend of dark to light, and you get a graded wash. So in a variegated wash, you have a wash that is created with at least two, or it can include more colors. Now, instead of a flat area of color, in a variegated wash, you have various tones, colors, and intensity in your painting. A variegated wash can be used as the first layer over foliage, or if you're creating clumps of leaves. With this variegated wash, you can offer visual interest and you can create depth in your painting. So to do this wash, just add several different washes of color next to each other on your watercolor paper and allow the colors to touch and bleed one another. You want to experiment with the colors that you use to make sure that when they do touch and bleed with each other, the borders don't turn gray, okay? You just want to make sure so that you don't ruin your painting there. So the technique lifting out color is one that doesn't really involve applying paint, but you're actually going to be removing paint from the surface of your paper. In order to lift out color, you end up creating kind of like really cool visual interest, like a sunburst that could be a part of a sunset, or you can reinstate highlights, or you can kind of create this illusion of reflections inside of water or glass in your painting. Now, in order to lift out color, you want to make sure that the painting area is very dry. Once it's dry, use clean water to reactivate that pigment. Using a small bristle brush, okay, you're going to scrub away the desired areas of paint. Now, if you're using a larger area where you want to lift out color, it's okay for you to use a semi-moist sponge to lift out the color, or you can dab wet paint with paper towels to lift out the color. Now, scumbling is a technique that you can use to create different textures and features if you're painting a landscape scene. So some of those features that you can use Scumbling for is to create clouds that have harder edges, shores that are rocky, and pathways that have gravel on it. In order to get the best results with Scumbling, you want to use rough watercolor paper, and you want to use larger, soft, round brushes. So to perform the Scumbling technique, take your brush and load it with color. Then you're going to wipe the brush gently with a paper towel just to get rid of any excess moisture. After you've done this, you hold the brush parallel to the paper and you use the sides of the bristle to lightly move your hand back and forth over the paper's surface, just grazing the surface of the paper and dusting paint onto the tooth of the rough paper. And then you get that kind of Scumbling technique. Next is stippling. And in this watercolor technique, you can use it to kind of get the image of water that is either falling or water that is splashing, and you can use it to get the image of leaves on a tree. So in order to do stippling, you're going to put your paper flat on a working surface and you're going to hold the brush at a steep angle. Once you do this, you're going to place random dots on the paint with the tip of your brush. So when you're doing the stippling technique, make sure your hand gesture is very light. You're doing a light touch and keep your brush firm and steady. You want to stipple randomly so that you get various sizes of the dots. And in order to have more variation in the sizes, you apply more or less pressure to the brush. So some of these will merge so that the effect is not really overdone, and you get best results when you use a blunt round brush. If you use a fine pointed brush, just keep in mind that this doesn't create the soft round shape that the stippling technique requires. So wet into wet or wet on wet technique requires a preparation before you get into it, but just know that the wet on wet technique, the watercolor paints will run and bleed and the paints will blend on their own. But before you get into the wet on wet technique, you'll want to stretch your watercolor paper beforehand to avoid buckling. And buckling is just after the paper dries, it kind of gets this weird, the edges lift. So in order to stretch your watercolor paper in preparation for the wet and wet technique, you're going to want to take your watercolor paper and you're going to immerse it in water and take it out. And you make sure that both sides are wet and you'll tape it down along the border of the paper to stretch it. If you notice that the paper is still really wet, you can use a sponge or a paper towel to just and run it over the paper to soak up any extra moisture or water with that sponge. Now, the wet on wet technique, in this technique, it really focuses on allowing the paints to blend on their own. Again, those colors are going to run and bleed and they're going to create soft edges and they're going to give you a nice lively pattern. So to do this technique, you want to use a flat surface and you want to put your paper on that surface. You're going to apply water on the paper while keeping your brush on the paper. Push the water around until it evenly covers the paper. Now, once that water settles, you're going to repeat this process one more time. After the second process, the paper should have a sort of satin sheen on it. There should be no drying areas or no pools of water. Once you have that satin sheen, you should apply diluted paint and allow the paint to run and bleed on their own, and then you'll get a wet on wet technique. So the last watercolor technique that I'm going to discuss is spattering. And spattering is a really good technique to use if you want to create random texture over an area. Now, this spattering watercolor technique itself can be really messy. And if you've already completed a painting before doing the spattering technique, you want to cover areas of the painting that you don't want to get affected with some pieces of scrap paper to protect it from paint droplets. So spattering can be used to create random mottled textures found in foliage and rough areas of ground. And sometimes you can use spattering to create snow in a scene. So for the spattering technique, you want to load a medium-sized round brush with paint. You're going to use your index finger to either tap the handle or the bristles of the brush. When you do this, dots of paint are going to be released onto your paper, and you can build up that spattered area and just allow it to dry flat on your working surface to get that effect. So that is it. I hope you really enjoyed this video, and thank you.